Hey everyone, my name is Milagros Miceli and I am here with my co-author Julian Posada, and we are very excited to present our ongoing research in the space of data annotation work for machine learning. In formal terms, the work of the data annotators participating in this research comprises two types of tasks. The first one is called semantic segmentation, and this one mostly concerns image data and is about marking and separating the different objects contained in a picture. And the second one is labeling. Labeling is about giving a name to the different elements contained in a given data point, and it can also be about assigning keywords to that data point. But beyond these formal task descriptions, the important thing to know about the work of data annotators is that it is about making sense of data. It's about interpreting the information contained in each data point, and it's about classifying those data. And because of its subjective and interpretative character, previous research in human data annotation has largely focused on the individual subjectivities of annotators to account for various data-related issues, especially the issue of bias labels. However, as we have described in a recently published paper, the interpretation of data as performed by annotators takes place in specific contexts and is very much informed and constrained by those contexts. So the sense-making of data and the creation of data sets for machine learning are situated practices that cannot be analyzed in the vacuum of personal subjectivities or bias. So what does this mean? It means that many issues that are framed as bias are actually manifestations of power asymmetries that fundamentally shape data. Power asymmetries that are as simple as being the boss with decision-making power or being a simple annotator whose job is on the line if they don't follow instructions, or being the client, the requester, paying for the annotations on the one hand, or being the outsourcing service company on the other hand, subject to the client's desire. So, in this sense, approaches to detect and mitigate bias often fail to question power structures, normalize preconceptions, and profit-oriented interests that get encoded in datasets. And questioning power is actually what is needed, what we think it is needed, to move beyond approaches that allocate responsibilities with individual actors, those actors being generally the workers, and be able to look at the bigger picture. Just to give you an idea, the workers participating in our study are located in Argentina and Venezuela. Inflation in Venezuela is brutal, and many people turn to the platforms because they offer an income in dollars, in US dollars, which is, of course, a steady currency. One of the workers we interviewed was retired, and she told us that her pension was the equivalent to $1, which is, as she said, not even enough to buy some bread. So working for the platform was, in this case, her lifesaver. Most of the workers we interviewed in Argentina lived in very poor neighborhoods or slums in or surrounding Buenos Aires. And for many of them, doing data annotation meant finally having a desk job and finally breaking with generations of doing unregistered cleaning or construction work. So if we just stopped at the level of individual biases, we would miss these contexts that very much inform the annotations that are being carried out. So for us researchers, this means shifting our gaze up and analyzing the experiences of workers and the structures, routines, and conditions in which training data is produced through outsourced, commodified labor. Now let's take a look at typical workflows in data annotation. The goal of every annotation project is to achieve a certain level of standardization in regard to the labels, but also of workflows. And most importantly, there is a constant attempt to standardize the individual subjectivities of workers so that they may interpret and label data in a similar manner. That type of standardization is assured throughout several layers of management and quality control, and those layers are not horizontal and not at all democratic. The higher the position occupied by an actor, the more power that actor has to impose meanings on data or to decide which labels best define a given data point. And on top of that hierarchy is, of course, the requester. The requester is the one who has the final say in this matter, because in the end, the requester is the one paying for the annotations to be carried out in the first place. So one fundamental thing to take into account here is that the requesters, and by requesters we mean machine learning practitioners, machine learning companies requesting the annotations, that the requesters have the faculty to impose their preferred labels and their preferred classifications and interpretations, just as they have the financial means to pay for annotators to execute that imposition. So power asymmetries not only shape labor conditions, they also fundamentally shape data and the systems that are trained on the basis of that data. Finally, this brings us to the annotation instructions. Task instructions are tailored to needs, plans, and interests that are related to the machine learning product that will be trained and produced on the basis of that annotated data. And they are formulated in such a way that they leave almost no space for annotators to exercise their own judgment beyond the options that are embedded in those assignments. So instructions aim at constraining individual subjectivities to achieve standardization. But because they are based on profit-oriented priorities and subjective worldviews, they comprise assumptions that, of course, will get encoded into data sets and systems. So Julian will now say more about how we plan to dig into those assumptions, how we plan to tackle this problem. But for now, I will just say that task instructions are so important because they are a tangible manifestation of the power requesters have to impose worldviews on annotators, and through them, through their labor, on data sets and systems.
To explore the discourse of these data annotation instructions, we will frame our research with the following questions. First, how are ground truth labels for machine learning datasets instructed to annotators? Second, what discourses are implicit in annotation instructions? And finally, what are the managerial practices related to those discourses? As Milagros mentioned, our study is based on platforms operating in Venezuela and BPOs in Argentina. Our instructions include a dozen documents from the Argentinian BPO and over 200 instructions from 5 different platforms. We have also conducted around 30 semi-structured interviews with workers and machine learning practitioners. Before the pandemic, some of these interviews were on site, which allowed us to gather data from observations about the context and relations that inform annotation tasks. To analyze this data, we used critical discourse analysis as a method, which allows us to study the power relations and worldviews inscribed in the annotation instructions. The final part of this presentation will focus on our preliminary findings. First, we observe that datasets encode the worldviews of those in positions of power, which are primarily the machine learning practitioners who are the clients of the platforms and BPOs. The annotation instructions reflect the particular worldviews of these actors. They require workers to categorize, label, enter data, and identify people, objects, and animals precisely, according to a set of preconceived ideas of how the world works and looks like. Thus, the taxonomies present in the instructions carry meanings that are self-evident to the requesters, but not necessarily relevant to the annotators and their communities. For instance, most instructions to label images according to racial categories are based on US-centered conventions. For self-driving cars, for example, annotation instructions refer to categories present in North American roads, such as signs and animals, that make little to no sense in an American context. Our second observation is that instructions reflect the commercial goals behind the machine learning systems created based on annotated data. Predefined categories and labels mainly follow profit-oriented goals that prioritize classifications with a commercial application or easier to operationalize in computational terms. For instance, when asked what would be the procedure if they were unsure about annotation instructions, most of the workers at the Argentine BPO answered that they would immediately follow the requester's opinions because, and I quote, their interpretation is usually the one that makes more sense, as they would know exactly what kind of systems they're developing and how they plan to commercialize it. Finally, we observe that the influence of powerful actors in data annotation is stabilized through narrow task instructions, tailored work interfaces, managers and quality assurance analysts in BPOs, and algorithms in labor platforms. As you can see on the right, annotation instructions refer to such control mechanisms. These messages reinforce the hierarchical structure of the annotation process and compel workers to follow the norms as instructed, giving data workers little room to improve the labels or voice ethical concerns. For example, workers at the Argentine company were encouraged to think about, and I quote, what the client might want and what would bring more value to them. Here, any concerns expressed at the workers' end are filtered through hierarchical managerial structures and hardly ever reach requesters. On the other hand, platform workers risk being banned and even expelled from the platforms if they dare contradict task instructions. Our work is still in progress, and we will continue to investigate the managerial process surrounding the instructions and especially how these instructions come to be. We will do this through feature observation and interviews with practitioners and clients of these services. We want to end our talk by arguing that while the potential harmful effects of algorithmic bias continues to be widely discussed, it is also essential to address how power imbalances and post-classification principles in data creation contribute to the reproduction of inequalities by artificial intelligence systems. We believe that the empowerment of workers and the decommodification of the labor away from market dependency, as well as the detailed documentation of outsourced processes of data creation, remain essential steps to allow spaces of reflection, deliberation, and audit that could potentially contribute to addressing some of the social questions surrounding artificial intelligence. Thank you very much, and we look forward to your questions.